In this video, we will learn about variable scope. The scope of a variable is the part of the program where the variable can be used. A variable cannot be used everywhere after you declare it. Its scope will determine where and how the variable can be used. Let's look at the different types of scope and their examples, and this will become a lot clearer. There are four types of scopes. There is class scope, there is bracket scope, there is loop scope, and there is method scope. Let's look at each of these in turn. So the first one we'll look at is the class scope. We've already discussed this. When you define a variable as private in a class, that variable can only be used within that class. So we can say that private variables have class scope since they can only be used within a class. We have discussed private variables in the previous chapter extensively, so we won't go into detail here. Let's look at bracket scope. In Java, you can create anonymous pairs of brackets and have code within that bracket pair, just like this. And within these two brackets, you can write some code. So we'll look at two things: variables that are declared outside of these brackets and variables that are declared inside these brackets. So let's say we have a variable x which is of integer type outside of these brackets. Let's define an integer y within the brackets. Now let's say I want to print out the addition of x and y. So the command would be the print command, and we'll say x plus y. You see, x is declared outside of these brackets. However, even inside the brackets, we can access x. If we run the program, the result would be the addition of x and y, which is 100. So variables declared outside of the brackets can be accessed inside the bracket, as long as everything is within the same method, of course. And here everything is within the main method. But if we try to do the same thing outside of the brackets, and let's say we want to print x plus y here as well, you see, y would give us an error, and it would say that it cannot resolve this symbol. This is because y does not exist outside of these brackets. Y was declared inside the bracket, and that is the scope of y. Outside of these brackets, the program would not be able to find y. Outside of these brackets, y does not exist. So y has bracket scope. Now let's look at loop scope. So let's write a loop first. So here we have a loop that has an iterator I. Let's define any variable inside the for loop. Let's say it is a string. So here we have a string a, and it has some value stored in it. If I want to use a within the for loop, of course I can do that. But what about outside the for loop? If we try to use a outside the for loop, the program cannot find it because a does not exist outside the loop. A was created inside the loop, and after the loop ends, the variable a is destroyed. So we can say that the variable a only has a scope that exists within the loop. So that is loop scope. Let's now talk about method scope. If we're defining a method, and let's say we name it some method, and we define variables inside the method, for example, an integer z maybe. Again, z exists only within the method. You cannot use z outside the method. In fact, the program will not find it outside the method, and it does not exist outside the method. When the method is called, this variable would be initialized, and when the method has returned or finished running whatever it needs to run, this variable would be destroyed. So we can say here that integer z has method scope. So these are the basic scopes in Java.